Okay, let's dive into a figure whose name alone evokes power, cunning, and, frankly, an astonishing mustache. Otto von Bismarck. Welcome to a deep dive into the life of the Iron Chancellor, the man who, well, more than anyone else, shaped modern Germany and profoundly impacted 19th century Europe.
Absolutely. Understanding, the Germany of today, and indeed the wider political landscape of Europe back then, is pretty much impossible without confronting Bismarck. Using the material we have, our mission today is to explore his entire journey from a Prussian country gentleman, sort of, to the architect of unification and the first imperial chancellor.
Right.
Examining not just the man and his actions, but also the turbulent political and cultural times he navigated.
Definitely. This is a figure whose story is just packed with surprising twists and strategic brilliance. We're going to explore this material together with you, pulling out the most important nuggets and aiming for those aha moments that help us really grasp this pivotal historical personality.
We'll take a thorough, impartial look at what the sources tell us, placing his life firmly in the context of his time.
Perfect. So let's start right at the very beginning. Before the legendary statesman, there was just, well, young Otto von Bismarck. What was his world like? How did he fit into it?
Okay, so Bismarck was born in 1815, a pretty significant year, just after the Napoleonic Wars ended at his family estate in Prussian Saxony. He came from the Junker class.
The Junker class.
Yeah, the landed nobility of Prussia, steeped in military and agricultural tradition. His father fit that mold perfectly, a former military officer. But importantly, his mother came from a different background, from a family of educated civil servants in Berlin.
Ah, okay. So a mix of influences there.
Exactly. It gave him this blend of aristocratic tradition and more intellectual, bureaucratic influences right from the start. He spent part of his childhood on a different family estate, Niefhof in Pomerania, which sources describe as, well, relatively simple, almost bucolic, despite their noble status.
And financially, were they rolling in it?
Surprisingly, no. Their finances were apparently quite average for their class, partly because his father wasn't great at managing the estates, it seems.
Interesting. And his education sounds like it prepared him for, well, more than just managing land.
Oh, definitely. He attended some of Prussia's top schools, then went on to University Göttingen in Berlin, later studying agriculture too. And it's during these university years we get these great glimpses of his personality from friends like the American John Lothrop Motley.
Oh, yeah. What did Motley have to say about him?
Well, Motley described the young Bismarck as reckless, dashing, eccentric, but also undeniably gifted and charming. So he wasn't just wild, he was clearly highly intelligent. And he picked up languages, really easily became fluent in English, French, Italian, Polish, Russian.
Wow, that multilingualism must have been useful later.
Incredibly useful, yeah. Crucial for his diplomatic career.
Sounds like quite the character. Did he settle into a career path right away?
Not exactly smoothly. His early attempts at civil service, like being a lawyer, were pretty short-lived. He actually resigned from one post, partly after taking unauthorized leave to pursue some English girls.
He didn't.
He did. And his required military service was also brief, just a one-year volunteer stint. It wasn't until his mother died, when he was in his mid-20s, that he returned to seriously manage the family estates.
So the wildness kind of gave way to some responsibility eventually, and he married.
Yes, eventually. Around age 32, in 1847, he married Johanna von Puttkamer. She was described as quite shy and deeply religious, a real contrast to him, although apparently she developed a pretty sharp tongue later on.
Huh, maybe she had to.
Maybe. But their marriage seems to have provided a stable personal anchor for him amidst his very turbulent public life. They had 3 children together.
So from these country estates and a bit of a restless youth, he finds some stability. But the political stage was clearly calling. How did he actually make that leap into politics?
Well, his entry came in the same year he married, 1847, at age 32. He was chosen as a representative to the new Prussian legislature, the Vereinigter Landtag, and he quickly gained attention.
But not as the pragmatist we think of.
No, not at all initially. He made his name as a fervent royalist, a staunch conservative, a real hardliner, actually.
Advocating for divine right and all that.
Exactly. Advocating the divine right of kings, known for his sharp, really stinging rhetoric. He was closely tied to the ultra-conservative Kurzzeitung faction. So yeah, this early reputation was quite different from the flexible statesman he'd eventually become.
And he stepped onto this stage just as Europe was being absolutely rocked by the revolutions of 1848. Talk about timing.
Incredible timing. Yeah, these revolutions demanding liberal reforms, national unification, they just swept across the continent. In Prussia, King Frederick William IV was, well, overwhelmed. He ended up making concessions appearing in revolutionary colors, promising a constitution.
Which Bismarck must have hated.
Oh, he was appalled. From his conservative viewpoint, these concessions were terrible. He later recalled hearing the frustrated rattling of sabers from army officers who just wanted to use force to crush the rebellion.
So while many liberals were pushing for unification in '48, Bismarck was actually against it.
Initially, yes. When he was elected to the Prussian Landtag in 1849, his stance was firmly against German unification. His big fear was that Prussia would lose its independence, its unique identity, within a larger German state.
So he actively opposed it.
He did. He even went to the Erfurt Parliament, which was discussing plans for union, specifically to argue against them.
What changed his mind then? What shifted him from opposing unification to becoming its architect?
A key moment seems to have been Prussia's humiliation at the punctation of Olmütz in 1850. Prussia tried to assert itself over a dispute in Hesse, but Austria, backed by Russia, basically forced them to back down.
Ouch.
Yeah, real slap in the face. It painfully highlighted Prussia's weakness compared to Austria, and seems to have convinced Bismarck that Prussia needed to be much more forceful.
And his time as envoy in Frankfurt seems absolutely critical here.
Hugely critical.
Yeah.
In 1851, he became Prussia's envoy to the German Confederation Diet in Frankfurt. He spent 8 years there, sending back these incredibly detailed reports to Berlin, and you can see his thinking evolving.
How so?
He becomes much more pragmatic. He realizes Prussia absolutely needs allies if it's going to challenge Austria's dominance within the Confederation. He starts seeing the Austrian representative, Count Thun, as his main adversary. There are stories of him, deliberately provoking Thun, like lighting a cigar when only Thun was smoking, or taking off his jacket when Thun did. Small things, but symbolic. It even led to a duel.
A duel? Serious?
Yes, with another delegate, Jörg von Vinken, though apparently neither was injured. But it shows his assertiveness. More importantly, politically, he starts seeing a united Germany not as a threat anymore, but as a potential vehicle for Prussian power, provided conservatives led the way.
And that meant making some unusual alliances.
Exactly. This is where his famous pragmatism really kicks in. He starts cultivating relationships not just with Russia, but even with Napoleon III's France, which absolutely horrified his conservative Junker friends back home.
Right. France was seen as the enemy.
Precisely. But Bismarck famously used that quote about playing chess and not putting 16 of the 64 squares out of bounds from the start. He was willing to deal with anyone if it served Prussia's interests. The irony, of course, is that France later became the permanent enemy, and he ended up allied with Russia.
That time in Frankfurt also showed him Prussia's isolation, didn't it? During the Crimean War.
It did. In the mid-1850s, during the Crimean War, Austria sided against Russia, leaving Prussia pretty isolated. That experience reinforced his fear of Germany being caught alone and definitely shaped his later alliance strategies. After Frankfurt, he served as ambassador to Russia, then briefly to France, giving him invaluable face time with key leaders like Tsar Alexander II, Gorchakov, Napoleon III, Palmerston, Disraeli, sizing them up.
And while he's doing this diplomatic groundwork, back home, two other crucial figures are rising.
Yes, absolutely essential partners. Helmuth von Moltke, who became chief of the Prussian General Staff, and Albrecht von Roon, the Minister of War. They were busy reorganizing and modernizing the Prussian army. These three, Bismarck providing the political direction, Roon the resources, and Moltke the military strategy, they formed this incredibly powerful triumvirate that would utterly transform Prussia.
Okay, so the stage is set, the army's being reformed, Bismarck has the diplomatic experience, and then he becomes Minister President in September 1862, stepping right into a massive domestic crisis.
Immediately, the liberal-dominated Prussian legislature, the Landtag, was refusing to approve Roon's budget for the army reforms. It was a major constitutional standoff. The king, Wilhelm I, was considering abdication. Bismarck was basically brought in as a last resort to break the deadlock and assert the king's authority over the army.
And how did he handle this constitutional crisis?
Delicately. Not exactly. He took a very confrontational approach. He argued there was a kind of legal loophole, since the Constitution didn't explicitly say what to do if the king and parliament couldn't agree on a budget.
He just ignored them.
Pretty much. He declared the government had a duty to keep running, so he just continued collecting taxes and spending money based on the previous year's budget. And he did this for 4 years. It was incredibly controversial, deeply unpopular with the liberals, and flew in the face of parliamentary power.
Wow. And this is the backdrop for probably his most famous speech.
Precisely. On September 30th, 1862, he's addressing the Budget Committee of the Landtag, trying to win them over, or at least explain his position. And he delivers the lines that became legendary. The great questions of the time will not be resolved by speeches and majority decisions that was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood.
Iron and blood. Pretty stark rejection of the liberal parliamentary way of doing things.
Absolutely. It was a crystal clear statement. He believed unification wouldn't come through debates and votes, which had failed in 48. It would come through military strength, the iron of the Prussian army, and through warfare, the blood. He was signaling Prussia would use power, not political compromise, to achieve its aims.
And he certainly followed through on that promise. The next decade or so saw Prussia engage in a series of, well, carefully orchestrated wars.
Yes, the Wars of Unification. Bismarck's strategy was brilliant, if ruthless. He used a combination of incredibly shrewd diplomacy and the modernized Prussian military under Moltke to achieve German unification step by step, always making sure to isolate his opponents and, crucially, to exclude Austria from the final German state, ensuring Prussian dominance.
First up was the Second Schleswig War in 1864. What was that about?
It involved a really complex dispute over two duchies, Schleswig and Holstein, which had large German populations but were ruled by the Danish king. When the Danish king tried to integrate Schleswig more closely, it violated earlier agreements. Bismarck, initially taking a complex legal stance that annoyed German nationalists, eventually allied with Austria to fight Denmark.
An alliance with Austria, his rival.
For the moment, yes. It suited his purpose. They defeated Denmark easily. But then, after the victory, Bismarck skillfully outmaneuvered Austria diplomatically, leading to the Gastein Convention in 1865. Prussia got to administer Schleswig, Austria got Holstein. It looked like a solution, but it really just set the stage for the next conflict. He was made account for his efforts, by the way.
Right, because the next war was against Austria just 2 years later in 1866.
Exactly. Disputes over the administration of Schleswig and Holstein gave Bismarck the pretext he needed. When Austria appealed to the German Confederation against Prussian actions, Bismarck declared the Confederation dissolved and attacked. Prussia occupied Holstein. Most other German states sided with Austria.
But Prussia was ready.
Prussia was incredibly ready. Roon's reforms meant the army was efficient, Moltke's planning was superb, they used railways effectively, had better rifles, and Bismarck secured a crucial secret alliance with Italy, promising them Venetia if they attacked Austria from the south. This forced Austria to divide its forces.
And during this incredibly tense period, he survived an assassination attempt.
Yes, right before the war began, a young man named Ferdinand Cohenblind shot him 5 times in Berlin. Amazingly, Bismarck only suffered minor bruises. The bullets apparently glanced off or were stopped by his thick coat. Cohenblind committed suicide in custody shortly after. A very close call.
Wow. So the Austro-Prussian War kicks off.
And it's incredibly swift. Just 7 weeks. The decisive battle was at Königgrätz or Sadowa. Prussia won a stunning victory, shattering the Austrian army and their German allies.
And after this huge victory, sources say the king and his generals wanted to march on Vienna, really humiliate Austria.
Yeah.
But Bismarck stopped them. Why the leniency?
This is classic Bismarck. Pure strategic thinking. He was terrified that pushing too hard would bring other powers, especially France, into the war, or that Prussia's luck might run out. He wanted Austria neutralized, not turned into a permanently bitter enemy. So he argued forcefully for a soft peace. No annexations of Austrian territory, no victory parades in Vienna.
He wanted them as potential future allies.
Or at least not sworn enemies. He knew he might need Austria's neutrality, or even help down the line. It took all his persuasive power, and apparently help from the Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, to get King Wilhelm I to agree. It was a masterstroke of looking beyond the immediate victory.
So Königgrätz secures Prussian dominance over northern Germany. The North German Confederation is formed. The final piece is bringing in the southern German states like Bavaria and Württemberg.
And that required dealing with France. Tensions had been rising since 1866. Napoleon III felt cheated. He hadn't gotten any compensation for staying neutral. There was a famous quote from the French politician Adolphe Thiers saying France was really defeated at Königgrätz. Bismarck didn't necessarily want war with France. Immediately, he worried about Austrian revenge or Russia helping France. But he calculated that if France could be made to look like the aggressor, The southern German states would rally to Prussia out of national feeling.
And he used some intrigue to make France look bad.
Oh, yes. He subtly leaked Napoleon III's tentative demands for territory like Luxembourg or parts of Belgium, making France appear greedy and expansionist. But the real spark came from Spain.
The Spanish throne crisis.
Exactly. The throne was offered to a distant relative of the Prussian king, Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. France went ballistic, seeing it as Prussian encirclement. Under intense French pressure, Leopold's candidacy was withdrawn.
But France pushed it too far.
They did. The French ambassador, Benedetti, met King Wilhelm I at the spa town of Ems and demanded a guarantee that Prussia would never allow a Hohenzollern candidacy in the future. The king politely refused this demand and declined another meeting, sending a telegram describing the encounter to Bismarck in Berlin.
Enter the Ems dispatch.
The famous Ems dispatch. Bismarck received the king's factual telegram. He then very carefully edited it for publication. He didn't exactly lie, but he condensed it and sharpened the language, making it sound like the king had insulted the French ambassador and the ambassador had been rudely dismissed.
Making both sides feel insulted.
Precisely. It inflamed public opinion in both Paris and Berlin. Historians still debate how decisive it was. War was probably likely anyway, but it certainly provided the immediate trigger. Bismarck himself later wrote in his memoirs that he believed war with France was necessary for unification to happen.
So France declared war in July 1870.
They did. And just as Bismarck predicted, the southern German states, seeing France as the aggressor, immediately joined Prussia. Patriotic fervor swept through Germany. Moltke's armies were again incredibly effective, winning major battles like Sedan and Metz, capturing huge French armies, even Emperor Napoleon III himself. The war ended with the long, hard siege of Paris.
There's a story about Bismarck quoting La Marseillaise.
Yes, apparently recorded years later in 1889. His biographer suggests it was likely mockery, reflecting his complex attitude towards France.
And with France defeated, unification could finally be achieved.
While the war was still ongoing, Bismarck negotiated treaties with the leaders of the southern German states. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden. He had to make some concessions, allowing them certain rights within the new structure, but the overwhelming wave of wartime nationalism sealed the deal.
Leading to that iconic scene in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles.
On January 18, 1871, with Paris still under siege nearby, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm I in the very palace built by France's Louis XIV, a hugely symbolic moment.
What kind of Germany did they create? Was it fully centralized?
Not entirely. It was a federation of 25 states, kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities. They kept a degree of autonomy, their own rulers, some local laws. But the King of Prussia was now also the German emperor, considered primus inter pares first among equals. He appointed the imperial chancellor.
Which was, of course, Bismarck.
Naturally. He was appointed the first imperial chancellor, raised to the rank of prince first, and crucially, he kept his powerful Prussian offices, like Minister President and Foreign Minister. This concentration of power in his hands was immense.
It's an astonishing achievement in less than a decade.
Truly remarkable. Historian Jonathan Steinberg calls this period culminating in unification, Bismarck's peak perhaps the greatest diplomatic and political achievement about any leader in the last 2 centuries, accomplished through, as he puts it, sheer force of personality, by his brilliance, ruthlessness, and flexibility of principle.
So having forged this empire, Bismarck remained chancellor for almost 2 more decades, until 1890. What was his focus after unification? The wars were over.
Right. After 1871, his main goal shifted dramatically. Externally, it was about preserving the peace in Europe and consolidating Germany's position. Internally, it was about solidifying the new Reich and dealing with groups he saw as potential threats to its unity and stability.
And one of the first big internal battles was the Kulturkampf, the culture struggle.
Yes, starting almost immediately in 1871, primarily in Prussia, but affecting the whole Reich. It was essentially an attack on the political influence of the Catholic Church.
Why target Catholics specifically? Germany was predominantly Protestant, wasn't it?
It was. But Bismarck, a devout Lutheran himself, seemed to genuinely fear the power of the papacy, especially after the doctrine of papal infallibility was declared in 1870. He saw it as a rival international power center challenging state authority. He was also deeply suspicious of the Catholic Center Party, which had quickly become a significant political force representing Catholic interests, potentially undermining his control.
So what did this struggle involve? What measures did he take?
They were pretty harsh, especially in Prussia. The state abolished the Catholic department in the Ministry of Culture, expelled the Jesuit order from Germany in 1872, Then came the May Laws of 1873, which brought clergy education under state control, restricted the church's disciplinary powers, made civil marriage compulsory. Many Prussian bishops and priests who resisted were imprisoned or forced into exile.
That sounds incredibly confrontational. Did it actually work? Did it weaken the church or the center party?
Quite the opposite, actually. The sources suggest it was a major miscalculation. Instead of breaking Catholic resistance, it galvanized them. Catholics rallied around their bishops and priests, seeing them as martyrs. The center party actually grew stronger, becoming a more unified and disciplined force in the Reichstag.
So it backfired.
Spectacularly. The British ambassador at the time, Otto Russell, reported that Bismarck's campaign had inadvertently turned previously quiet bishops into powerful popular leaders. Some historians analyzing Bismarck's actions during this period describe his temper and intolerance, suggesting the measures became excessive, almost demonic in their intensity.
So why did he eventually abandon it?
A few reasons came together around 1878. Firstly, he realized the campaign wasn't working and was actually strengthening his opponents. Secondly, he grew alarmed that secular liberals and socialists were using the Kulturkampf to attack all religion, not just Catholicism. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, he needed a new political ally. The Center Party itself. He needed their votes in the Reichstag to pass laws against a new perceived enemy, the socialists. The death of the confrontational Pope Pius IX and the election of the more pragmatic Pope Leo III also made negotiation easier. Most of the anti-Catholic laws were gradually repealed, though the state kept control over education and civil marriage.
Okay, so he pivots from fighting Catholics to fighting socialists. What was his issue with the socialists?
Bismarck was deeply alarmed by the rise of the International Socialist Movement and, specifically, the German Social Democratic Party, SPD. He saw them as revolutionary, anti-monarchical, anti-national, a fundamental threat to his conservative, authoritarian state.
So how did he try to deal with them?
More harsh laws. Exactly. Since the SPD was a legal party protected by the Constitution, he couldn't just ban it outright. So starting in 1878, he pushed through the anti-socialist laws. These didn't ban the party itself, but they banned socialist organizations, trade unions, meetings, newspapers, and literature. They gave the police wide powers to suppress socialist activity and harass members.
Did that work? Did it stop the SPD?
Nope. Another miscalculation in many ways. While the laws certainly made life difficult for socialists, they didn't destroy the movement. If anything, the repression seems to have increased solidarity among workers and may have even helped the SPD. They continued to gain votes and seats in the Reichstag throughout the 1880s, often running as independent candidates.
So repression failed against Catholics, and it failed against socialists. This seems to lead to his other major domestic legacy, the pioneering social welfare legislation.
Precisely. Bismarck realized that simply banning things wasn't enough. He needed to offer something positive to win the loyalty of the working class away from the socialists and towards the state, towards the emperor. This led to his groundbreaking social insurance programs in the 1880s.
Often called state socialism, right?
Yeah.
Was he actually a socialist?
Not at all. He used the term, perhaps ironically, but his motivations were conservative. He called it practical Christianity. His goals were clear: strengthen the state, bind workers to the existing regime, maintain traditional authority, and crucially, steal the socialists' thunder by addressing some of the workers' real grievances.
Yeah.
He argued the state had a duty to care for its helpless citizens, just like it provided defense or infrastructure.
What specific programs did he create?
It was a series of major insurance laws. First, the Sickness Insurance Law of 1883, which made health insurance compulsory for most industrial workers, funded jointly by employers, 1/3, and workers, 2/3. Then came the Accident Insurance Law in 1884, funded entirely by employers, providing coverage for medical treatment and pensions in case of workplace accidents. And finally, the Old Age and Disability Insurance Law of 1889, providing pensions for workers over 70 and disability benefits, funded by employers, workers, and a contribution from the state.
This was truly revolutionary for its time, laying the foundation for the modern welfare state.
Absolutely. Germany was way ahead of other industrial nations in this regard, and these programs had a real tangible impact. Sources suggest they played a key role in the sharp decline in German immigration to America around this time. Workers started factoring in these indirect wages, these social benefits, when considering their future.
Okay, so domestically, a real mix of repression and progressive social policy. What about foreign policy during his chancellorship? He unified Germany through war, but now what?
Now, his absolute priority was peace. It's a key transformation. Having created this powerful new German empire in the center of Europe, Bismarck the war maker became Bismarck the peacemaker. His overarching goal was to preserve the status quo, maintain Germany's position, and above all, prevent a major European war, especially one that might involve Germany fighting on two fronts.
And his main fear was a hostile coalition.
Constantly. He was haunted by the nightmare scenario, a coalition of France, Russia, and possibly Austria-Hungary aligned against Germany. So his entire diplomatic strategy after 1871 was geared towards preventing that, primarily by keeping France isolated and maintaining good relations with at least two of the other major powers.
How did he try to achieve that?
Through incredibly complex, pragmatic diplomacy, he studied other countries' interests relentlessly, looking for ways to create overlapping alliances and understandings that would make war less likely. He wanted to convince Europe that Germany was saturated, that it had no further territorial ambitions. His main problem was France.
Because of Alsace-Lorraine.
Exactly. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War, which Bismarck apparently accepted somewhat reluctantly for military reasons, created lasting French resentment revanchism. He knew France would likely seek revenge if given the chance. Though some sources suggest he later thought the French actually got over it faster than he'd expected, maybe calling the annexation itself a tragic mistake in hindsight. Still, isolating France was key.
So he built this famous system of alliances.
Yes, this intricate web designed to keep the peace by linking potential adversaries. First came the League of the Three Emperors in 1873, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. It was meant to manage Eastern Europe and keep troublesome groups like the Poles and Czech, but it was inherently unstable because of Austrian-Russian rivalry in the Balkans.
But he needed something more solid.
Right. When the League faltered, he negotiated the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879. This was a defensive alliance specifically targeting Russia. Then, in 1882, he brought Italy into the fold, creating the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy.
But he didn't want to completely alienate Russia either.
No, that was crucial. He needed to prevent that Franco-Russian alliance. So even while allied with Austria against Russia, he secretly negotiated the reinsurance treaty with Russia in 1887. This basically said Germany and Russia would remain neutral if the other was attacked by a third power, unless Germany attacked France or Russia attacked Austria-Hungary. It was incredibly complex, maybe even contradictory, but it kept Russia from drifting towards France.
And the fact that treaty wasn't renewed after he left office was a huge deal.
A critical failure of post-Bismarckian diplomacy, according to many historians. It opened the door for the Franco-Russian alliance he had worked so hard to prevent. Bismarck himself was always cautious about Russia, famously saying a preemptive war against them would be suicide for fear of death.
What about colonies? Germany suddenly jumped into the colonial game in the 1880s. Did Bismarck want an overseas empire?
Initially, he was very much against it. He saw colonies as expensive, difficult to manage, a source of friction with other powers like Britain, and a distraction from Germany's crucial position in Europe. He apparently even said he was happy for France to get colonies like Morocco, as it would keep them occupied elsewhere.
So why the sudden reversal around 1883-84?
It's debated. Public opinion was shifting, demanding colonies for national prestige. Powerful merchant groups, especially in Hamburg, were pushing for them. Some argue Bismarck might have used it to undercut domestic liberal opponents who tended to be anti-colonial. Whatever the exact mix of reasons, Germany suddenly acquired a substantial colonial empire in Africa: Togoland, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, East Africa, and the Pacific.
And he hosted the Berlin Conference to regulate it all.
Yes, in 1884-85. It set down rules for the scramble for Africa, aiming to prevent colonial disputes from spilling over into European conflicts. Some historians, like Hans Ulrich Wehler, argue this whole colonial push was mainly driven by internal pressures within Germany, trying to manage industrialization, class conflict, and maintain traditional power structures through nationalism.
But despite all these potential flashpoints, the Balkans, colonies, he managed to keep Europe out of a major war for his entire time as Chancellor after 1871.
He did. He was very clear about avoiding German entanglement in things like Balkan crises unless German interests were directly threatened. He famously quipped in 1888 that the Eastern question wasn't worth the healthy bones of one of our Pomeranian musketeers. It was a remarkable balancing act. Diplomatic historian William L. Langer really summed it up, praising Bismarck's system for steering Europe through a dangerous period with great moderation and sound political sense, preventing a major rupture for decades.
An incredible run. But it didn't end on his own terms, did it? What led to his dismissal in 1890?
Fundamentally, it was a clash with the new young Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who took the throne in 1888 after his father, Frederick III's very brief reign. Wilhelm II was ambitious, impulsive, and wanted to rule personally, not just reign. He had his own ideas, especially on social policy. He was interested in addressing things like mine worker strikes directly.
And he started interfering with Bismarck's running of the government.
Yes. He would interrupt Bismarck in council meetings, wanted direct reports from ministers, bypassing the Chancellor. The major flashpoint came over the anti-socialist laws, which were due for renewal. Bismarck wanted to make them permanent and even stronger, possibly provoking a confrontation he could use to crush the socialists. Wilhelm II disagreed. He wanted to woo the working class and refused, as he put it, to open his reign with a bloody campaign against his own subjects.
A fundamental disagreement on strategy.
Completely. Bismarck felt undermined, unappreciated. He tried various maneuvers, even appearing to go along with Wilhelm's ideas for international labor conferences, while working behind the scenes to sabotage them. The final straw came when Bismarck, seeking a new parliamentary majority after his allies lost seats, started talking to the leader of the Catholic Center Party, Ludwig Windthorst, without informing the Kaiser first.
And Wilhelm found out.
Wilhelm found out and was absolutely furious. He felt the emperor had the right to be informed about such negotiations. There was apparently a very heated argument. Wilhelm then demanded Bismarck rescind an old cabinet order from 1851, which stipulated that Prussian ministers had to report to the king through the Minister President, Bismarck.
Taking away Bismarck's control over the Prussian government, his power base.
Exactly. It left Bismarck totally cornered. He couldn't operate like that. He drafted a blistering letter of resignation detailing his complaints about Wilhelm's interference, though it was only published after his death. He was essentially forced out, dismissed by Wilhelm II on March 18, 1890. He was 75 years old.
75. After decades at the pinnacle of power. How did the Iron Chancellor handle retirement? Did he go quietly?
Not really. He was given honorary titles Colonel General with the rank of Field Marshal, Duke of Lauenburg, but he apparently joked the dukedom was only useful for traveling incognito and saw it as a mockery of his ambitions. He was elected to the Reichstag again, but was humiliated by being forced into a second ballot against a social democrat in Hamburg, and he never actually took the seat.
So he lived resentfully.
Very much so, it seems. He retired to his estates, Friedrichsruh and Varzin, feeling bitter and unappreciated, waiting for calls for advice from the Kaiser that never came. His wife Johanna died in 1894, which was a heavy blow. His health declined. He ended up in a wheelchair. His final years were largely spent writing his memoirs, Gedanken und Erinnerungen, thoughts and memories.
Were they well received?
They were hugely popular bestsellers. But they were also highly subjective, self-serving, and used to continue his feud with Wilhelm II, attacking the Kaiser and justifying his own actions. He even controversially published the secret reinsurance treaty with Russia in the press, a major breach of national security, just to show how Wilhelm's government had messed up.
Wow. And he even managed one last symbolic jab from beyond the grave.
He did. He died on July 30th, 1898, aged 83. For his sarcophagus at Friedrichsruh, he dictated the inscription himself, a loyal German servant of Emperor Wilhelm I, a very pointed omission of Wilhelm II.
A dramatic end to a dramatic life. So looking back now, what is the enduring legacy of this absolutely monumental figure?
Well, historians pretty much all agree on his central achievement, the unification of Germany itself. Transforming hundreds of disparate states into a single powerful nation was, as Steinberg said, a monumental diplomatic and political feat.
And after 1871, his diplomacy kept the peace.
For 2 decades, yes. His astute, cautious, complex diplomacy maintained stability in Europe, successfully isolating France and keeping Germany on good terms with other major powers. He created a system designed for peace, assuming Germany was saturated.
But that system didn't outlast him.
No, that's a key part of his legacy's complexity. Critics argue the system was too dependent on his personal genius and management. When Kaiser Wilhelm II abandoned his careful continental diplomacy for ambitious, expansionist Weltpolitik, the alliances shifted, Germany became increasingly isolated, and Bismarck's successors couldn't prevent the slide towards World War I. His careful balance was undone.
What about his impact within Germany, domestically?
It's deeply debated. He's sometimes called a white revolutionary because he co-opted nationalism and pioneered welfare policies, things usually associated with the left, to strengthen the conservative state. He certainly reshaped German politics. But critics like Henry Kissinger argue that by achieving unification through authoritarian means and undermining liberalism, he left German political culture with a dangerous legacy nationalism without liberalism, which contributed to later problems like the failure of the Weimar Republic.
And his personality remains controversial too.
Very much so. While acknowledging his brilliance, many historians, especially British ones like Steinberg or Evans, paint a less flattering picture of the man himself, describing him as vengeful, controlling, unscrupulous, a demonic genius who played on others' weaknesses, prone to fits of rage and anxiety, mixing brutal honesty with deceit. They argue he created a powerful state, but left it with a flawed constitution that gave too much power to the emperor, planting a kind of time bomb.
So praise for the achievement, but serious questions about the methods and the long-term stability of what he built.
Exactly. And the public memory is complex too. Immediately after his dismissal and death, there was a huge outpouring of national feeling. Countless monuments, Bismarck towers, statues were built across Germany and even worldwide.
The Bismarck myth.
Yes, a powerful myth was created, often simplifying him into just the heroic, iron-willed unifier. This myth ignored the nuances, the diplomatic caution of his later years, and was often used politically, especially by conservatives and nationalists later on, sometimes as an anti-democratic symbol against the Weimar Republic. Different groups remembered him differently. Junkers, liberals, socialists, Catholics, Poles, they all had their own Bismarck.
A figure of immense skill, undeniable impact, but whose methods, personality, and the ultimate consequences of his actions remain, well, deeply debated.
Absolutely. A man who profoundly shaped his world and whose legacy continues to be picked apart and analyzed today. He forces us to think about how nations are made and at what cost.
It certainly does. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? When you look at the Germany Bismarck created, the immense power and the internal tensions, and then the path Germany took after him, what does the story of the Iron Chancellor tell us about the complex relationship between brilliant, ruthless leadership and the long-term health and direction of a nation? For better, and perhaps for worse?
That's a question historians and we are still grappling with.
Indeed. Well, that was a fascinating deep dive into a truly remarkable and complicated life. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of Otto von Bismarck.